The grand lobby of the Aurora Concert Hall was a shimmering aquarium of light and sound. It was the final night of their Crossroads of Music festival, a week meant to blur the lines between the elite and the everyday. Well-dressed patrons sipped sparkling wine, their chatter bouncing off the marble floors and soaring glass walls. In the center of it all, like a throne, sat a gleaming black concert grand piano dot and holding court before it was the king of this castle, Maestro Vance. He was a man who wore his importance like his tailored tuxedo, impeccably and without a hint of doubt. His silver hair was a perfect wave, his gestures were sharp and precise. He was explaining, in a voice that carried, the profound architecture of a Beethoven sonata to a small, eager circle of supporters. They nodded, hanging on every word, laughing at his dry jokes. He was not just a conductor. He was an event. The main doors sighed open, letting in a gust of cool night air and the distant murmur of the city. A young woman slipped inside. She looked out of place, a sketch in charcoal against the lobby's watercolor brightness. Her jacket was worn at the elbows, her jeans simple, and she carried a faded canvas bag over one shoulder. She moved with a quiet purpose, not toward the crowd or the bar, but directly toward the grand piano. A few people glanced her way, their expressions mild with curiosity. Before turning back to the maestro dot, she ignored them all. She placed her bag gently on the floor, sat on the polished bench, and without a moment of hesitation, let her fingers find the keys. She didn't play a famous tune. What flowed out was something else entirely, a ripple of notes that sounded like a conversation, thought given sound. It was melancholic one moment, playful the next, a complex, soulful improvisation that seemed to pull the very quiet from the air around. Her dot the crowd's chatter began to stutter and die. Heads turned. Someone shushed their companion. The music was a net, drawing them in. It was alive, immediate, and raw in a way the polished recordings playing overhead were not. People on the upper balconies leaned over the rails to see the source. For a full minute, the only sound in the vast lobby was the piano. Speaking a language everyone understood in their gut dot maestro, Vance had stopped talking. The smile was gone from his face, replaced by a tight, frozen look. This was his event in his hall. This intrusion was not part of the program. The respectful silence of the audience, which he usually commanded, was now being given freely to this stranger. His authority was seeping away. Note by note, his patience snapped. He strode forward, his shoes clicking decisively on the marble, a general marching to retake lost ground. He did not wait for a pause or a natural end. He simply reached out and placed his hand flat on the piano's high notes, killing the vibration with a dull, discordant thud. The spell shattered. The woman's hands froze above the keys. A collective, almost painful gasp went through the audience. They looked startled, as if woken from a deep sleep. Vance didn't look at the woman at first. He addressed the room, a thin smile on his lips. "My apologies for the interruption," he said, his voice slick and loud. "The scheduled program will resume shortly." Then, and only then, did he look down at her. His eyes were cold, dismissive. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded bill, and with a gesture that was both casual and utterly contemptuous, he tossed it into the dark hollow of the piano bench. It was a tip for a beggar, not payment for an artist. The Crossroads of Music is about curated excellence, he said, and now his words were clearly for her, though he still played to the crowd. Not random noise. Street performers belong on the street. A few nervous titters came from his circle of followers. Most of the crowd, however, was silent, uncomfortable. The woman, Alara, did not protest. She did not argue. She simply looked from the money in the bench to his face. Her expression was unreadable, not angry, not sad. It was simply observant. as if she were memorizing him. She slowly closed the fallboard over the keys, a soft, final click. She retrieved her bag, stood up, and without a single word, walked back towards the heavy doors. As she passed an older man in a maintenance uniform, a stagehand who had been watching from the shadow of a pillar, she caught his eye. He gave her the smallest, saddest shake of his head, a silent apology for the ugliness he'd witnessed. She offered no smile in return, just a slight, acknowledging blink. The main doors closed behind her with a solid thump, sealing the warm, perfumed air back inside. In the sudden quiet, the recorded classical music piped through the speakers, sounded tinny and fake. Vance clapped his hands together, a sharp sound. Now, as I was saying about the structural genius of the second movement, he began, but the magic of the evening was broken. People listened politely, but their eyes kept drifting to the empty piano bench, and their ears still seemed to ring with the ghost of the music that had been so rudely silenced. The stagehand picked up his broom and walked away, muttering to himself about the price of pride. Outside, the city's symphony of traffic and life swallowed the girl whole, as if she had never been there at all. The storm hit the Aurora Concert Hall exactly 1 week later. It wasn't made of rain and wind, but of a single devastating phone call. Mikhail, the great piano virtuoso, the headline soloist for the season's most important gala, was in a hospital bed with a severe infection. He wouldn't be playing, not next week, not for a month. The news dropped into the hall's plush offices like a bomb. Panic, cold and sharp, took over. The gala was sold out. Tickets had cost a small fortune. Critics from major publications were flying in. The hall's reputation, its entire season, was balanced on this one night. Maestro Vance paced in the managing director's office, his frustration like a visible heat haze around him. There are protocols, understudies. We call the agency. We get a replacement, he insisted, waving a hand as if swatting the problem away. The managing director, a woman with tired eyes named Anya, scrolled through a list on her tablet. We have called. Everyone of his caliber is booked or on the other side of the world. The best we can get on this notice is competent. Competent is not good enough. Vance snapped. This audience pays for excellence, for genius. They will not accept a substitute teacher. The meeting grew louder, more desperate. The head of marketing talked about refunds and public relations disasters. The artistic administrator suggested maybe they could change the program, do a symphony without a soloist. Vance vetoed it all. The air was thick with the smell of fear and expensive coffee in the corner of the room. Near the door, an older man in a simple button-down shirt shifted his weight. He was the head stagehand, a man who had worked in the hall for 30 years. He had seen soloists come and go, divas throw tantrums, and conductors have their moments of glory and meltdown. He cleared his throat, a soft, rough sound. Everyone turned. He wasn't usually part of these high-level talks. Yes, Leo? Anya said, her voice thin with stress. The old stagehand, Leo, looked at his worn boots for a second, then up at the room. What about that girl? From the lobby last week. A beat of confused silence followed. The street player, Leo clarified. The one with the... the whole thing with the maestro. Vance let out a short, humorless laugh. Have you lost your mind? We are discussing the International Gala, not a busking festival in the subway. But Anya's eyes had narrowed, not in dismissal, but in memory. Wait, she said slowly. She turned to her computer, her fingers tapping quickly. The video. That cell phone video from the lobby. It got a lot of views locally. People were talking about it. She turned the screen around. It showed the frozen frame of the young woman at the piano, her face intent, just before Vance had stopped her. The people in the lobby that night, Leo said quietly, his voice gaining a little strength. They weren't just being polite. They were hooked. I've been around pianos my whole life, setting them up, tuning them a bit. That girl, her touch, it wasn't just playing. It was different. She had a real technique under all that feeling. Vance scoffed again, but it was weaker this time. The memory of that night was prickly. He remembered the uncomfortable silence that had followed the incident, how the rest of his event had felt flat. He remembered the look in her eyes, not anger, but a kind of deep, knowing calm that annoyed him more than any shout would have. Anya was already searching online. The video has comments. Hundreds of them. Who is she? That was breathtaking. Shame on the conductor. She looked up, a strange new light in her eyes. This could be a story. Not just a replacement, but a discovery. A moment. The street musician who gets her shot at the big stage. It's a circus act, Vance muttered, but he could see the others in the room latching onto the idea. The marketing head was nodding slowly, seeing the headline. The artistic administrator looked intrigued. We have no other choice that doesn't end in catastrophe, Anya said firmly, her decision made. We find her. Finding her wasn't as hard as they thought. Someone in the publicity department remembered a regular city blogger who featured street performers. A few calls later, and they had a location. The King Street Subway Arcade, a long tiled tunnel known for its buskers and echoing acoustics. Anya went herself, with Leo for moral support. They found her halfway down the arcade, past the saxophonist and the folk singer. She was there, at an old scarred upright piano that someone had donated to the space years ago. A small crowd of commuters was gathered, some standing still, others dropping coins into her open bag as they passed. She was playing something complex and sorrowful, a classical piece that felt utterly out of place in the gritty tunnel, yet somehow perfect. The sound of the trains rumbling underneath was her percussion. They waited until she finished. Anya approached, feeling suddenly nervous. She introduced herself and the hall. She explained the situation, the sick soloist, the desperate need, the upcoming gala. The young woman, Alara, listened quietly. She wiped her hands on her jeans. She didn't seem surprised, or excited, or even angry about the previous week's humiliation. She just looked thoughtful, as if working out a difficult puzzle in her head. And Maestro Vance? She asked, her voice quiet but clear over the distant subway hum. He will be conducting, Anya said carefully. It is his orchestra, but the board is extending this invitation to you. It is a professional engagement, with full pay and respect. Alara looked at the old upright piano, then down the tunnel towards the world above, where the concert hall stood like a palace of crystal. A faint, almost invisible smile touched her lips. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who has just seen the pieces of a strange game fall into place. I have one condition, she said, turning back to Anya. Anything within reason. I play the piece one choose, not the one that was scheduled. Anya blinked. The scheduled concerto was a famous, crowd-pleasing warhorse. Changing it was a big risk. But looking into Alara's steady gaze, she knew this was not a negotiable point. This was the heart of the deal. All right, Anya said, taking a deep breath. You can choose your piece. What will it be? Alara told her. The name meant nothing to Anya, but Leo, the old stagehand, who had been listening quietly, drew in a sharp breath. He looked at Alara with new, deep respect, and a flicker of something like worry. It's a hard one, he murmured, almost to himself. A real killer. All softness and whispers until it tears your heart out. Alara just nodded, as if that was exactly the point. She agreed to come to the hall the next day for a rehearsal. As Anya and Leo walked back to the surface, the sound of the subway fading behind them, Leo shook his head again. What have we just done? He whispered .inya, her mind already racing with logistics and press releases. Replied, we've either just saved the gala, or we've set the stage for the biggest disaster in the hall's history. There is no in-between. The backstage area of the Aurora Hall on gala night was usually a scene of focused, quiet energy. Tonight, it was a hospital ward of nervous tension. The air smelled of rosin, old wood, and the sharp scent of fear. In his private dressing room, Maestro Vance stood before a full-length mirror, adjusting his bow tie with sharp, angry tugs. The room was filled with the gentle hum of the orchestra warming up on the other side of the heavy curtain, a sound that usually filled him with power. Tonight, it felt like the buzzing of angry insects. The memory of the managing director, Anya, informing him of the girl's chosen piece played in his head. He had scoffed openly. It was a salon piece, a delicate watercolor, not a proper concerto for a gala. It confirmed everything he thought about her. She was an amateur. A street corner novelty act who would crumble under the lights. His assistant, a young man with a perpetually worried face, tapped on the door and entered. Sir, the soloist has arrived. She's in the green room. Vance didn't turn from the mirror. Is she dressed? Or did she come straight from the gutter? The assistant swallowed. She's dressed, sir. She's asking about a brief meeting to discuss tempos. A short, cold laugh escaped Vance. Tempos? She will follow my tempo. That is how this works. Tell her there will be no discussion. She will watch my baton, and she will follow. If she can. He dismissed the assistant with a wave. He would not give her the dignity of a conversation. He would treat her as the hired substitute she was, an unfortunate necessity to be tolerated and then forgotten. He could already picture the reviews. Vance's masterful leadership salvaged an evening marred by an underwhelming, if curious, last-minute replacement. Across the hall, in the simple, brightly lit green room, Alara was a pool of stillness. She wore a simple, dark dress, nothing flashy. It was clean and elegant, but it wasn't from a designer boutique. It looked like something that could endure. She was sitting in a chair, her eyes closed, her hands resting palms up on her knees. She wasn't practicing finger movements on the air. She was just breathing. Anya, the managing director, hovered near the door, a living statue of anxiety. Is there anything you need? Water? Tea? The orchestra is, well, they're professionals. They'll follow the maestro's lead, of course. Alara opened her eyes. They were calm, almost serene. They will follow the music, she said softly. The music leads. Everyone else follows. Before Anya could untangle that thought, the old stagehand, Leo, poked his head in. He carried a small, warm cloth bag. He gave Alara a nod that was different from the nervous energy of everyone else. It was a look of solidarity. Thought you might want these, he said, his voice a low rumble. He pulled out 2 small, flat pieces of dark, well-polished wood. Piano key tops, spares, from the old practice room upright. It's silly, maybe, but they're real ivory, old. They've got history in them. Feels different under the fingers than the new plastic. He placed them gently on the table beside her. Alara picked one up. She ran her thumb over its smooth, slightly porous surface. A real, warm smile, the first anyone had seen from her, touched her lips. Thank you, she said, and the words carried real weight. It was a musician thanking a craftsman. He understood, in a way the others in the building never could. Leo lingered for a moment. That piece you picked, he said, his voice even lower. My wife, she loved it. She used to say it wasn't played with the hands, but with the breath. He looked at Alara, his old eyes searching hers. You know what you're walking into out there, don't you? Alara looked from the keytop in her hand to the closed door that led to the stage. The muffled sound of the orchestra was a distant storm. I do, she said simply. The call came over the speaker. 15 minutes to places. The hall was packed. The audience was a sea of sequins and black ties, a low murmur of excited conversation filling the space. They had all heard the gossip, the 6-star, the mysterious replacement, the rumor of some confrontation. It added a spice of drama to the usual glamour. Backstage, Vance walked to the conductor's entrance, his back rigid. He did not look at Alara, who was now standing in the shadows near the piano, her hands at her sides. The stage manager gave the signal. The house lights began to dim. The audience's chatter died away into an expectant hush. Vance adjusted his cuffs, took a deep, theatrical breath, and walked onto the stage to a wave of polite, familiar applause. He gave a tight, brief bow, acknowledging his public. Then he turned, raised his arms, and the orchestra stood for him. The ritual was comforting. This was his territory. The managing director, Anya, stepped out in front of the curtain. Her voice, amplified, sounded brittle. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your understanding tonight. Due to the sudden illness of our scheduled soloist, we are profoundly fortunate to present a remarkable young artist making her debut with our orchestra. Please welcome Alara. The applause was curious, mixed with uncertainty. The spotlight swung to the side of the stage. Alara walked out. She did not stride. She did not smile brightly or wave. She simply walked to the center of the stage, to the magnificent concert grand, as if it were just another piano in a subway tunnel. She gave a slight, respectful nod to the audience, then to the orchestra. Finally, and most briefly, she glanced at Vance on the podium. Her expression was unreadable. She sat. She adjusted the bench with a quiet scrape that echoed in the silent hall. She placed the old ivory keytops Leo had given her on the polished wood beside her. She didn't need them, but they were a touchstone. Then she folded her hands in her lap and waited. Vance, his mouth a thin line, looked out at the orchestra. He gave a short, sharp nod. He raised his baton, paused for a second of supreme authority, and brought it down. The first, shimmering notes from the violins filled the hall. It was the introduction to Ravel's The Valley of the Bells. The music was soft, hazy, creating a landscape of mist and distant echoes. Vance conducted with small, precise movements. It was technically correct, but it felt controlled, contained. Then it was Alara's entrance. A single, perfect, ringing note. A bell dot from that very first touch. Everything changed. The sound she pulled from the piano wasn't loud, but it was so clear, so perfectly placed, it seemed to hang in the air like a physical thing. Her hands moved with a fluid grace that made the incredibly difficult passage work look simple, like water flowing over stones. Vance on the podium felt the shift immediately. The orchestra, trained to watch him, began to falter. Their ears were pulled to the piano. A cellist instinctively leaned into a phrase, following the sigh Alara had just created with her right hand, not the beat Vance was rigidly marking. Vance's eyes widened slightly. He gestured more forcefully, trying to pull them back, but Alara was in her own world, a world of incredible subtlety. She wasn't playing at the orchestra. She was inviting them into a space she was creating. Her dynamics were breathtaking from a whisper so faint the audience leaned forward to hear, to a sudden resonant chord that vibrated in the chest. She wasn't just hitting the notes. She was coloring them with feeling loneliness, memory, a fleeting glimpse of beauty. Vance became a man fighting a tide. He was trying to conduct the painting, but the painting was already alive and moving on its own. He was no longer leading. He was reacting, trying to catch up to the emotional world spilling from the piano. A cold trickle of sweat ran down his spine under his tailored jacket. He could see the faces of his first violins, not on his baton, but on Ilara's hands. They were playing with her, for her. The piece was a journey through a dreamscape, and Ilara was the guide. As the final, evaporating notes faded from the piano, leaving only a ghost of sound from the strings, the hall was plunged into a silence more profound than any he had ever commanded. It was a stunned, breathless silence. Then it broke. The applause wasn't the polite, programmed applause for the conductor. It was a roar. It was a physical wave of sound, people leaping to their feet, shouting, their faces filled with genuine awe. The spotlight was firmly, irrevocably on the woman in the simple dark dress, sitting quietly by the piano, her head slightly bowed. Vance stood on his podium, his arms at his sides, his baton dangling uselessly from his fingers. He was a statue in the middle of a hurricane. He had not been booed. He had not been criticized. He had simply been made invisible. The career he had built, the authority he wore so proudly, had not been attacked. It had been gently, beautifully, and completely forgotten. The applause was a force of nature. It crashed against the stage in wave after wave, a roaring, living thing. The audience wasn't just clapping. They were stomping their feet, shouting, "Brava!" from the balconies, their faces glowing with the kind of excitement that can't be faked. The sound was for one person alone. Ilara sat at the piano, her head bowed. The final whispered note she had played still seemed to hang in the air between her and the 1,000 people in the hall. She took one slow, deep breath, the first movement she'd made since the music ended. Then she stood up. She did not smile, a triumphant smile. She gave a slow, deep, and genuine bow from the waist, her hand resting lightly on the piano for balance. It was a gesture of thanks, not of conquest. From his podium, Maestro Vance felt like he was looking at the scene from behind thick, soundproof glass. The noise was muffled, the lights too bright. His arms were still slightly raised, frozen in the position of the final beat. His baton felt like a piece of dead weight in his hand. He slowly lowered his arms, the movement stiff and unnatural. He tried to turn and acknowledge the orchestra. This was the protocol, the conductor's moment to share the applause with his musicians. But as he turned, he saw the truth. The musicians in the orchestra were also applauding. Not for him, for her. The first violinist, a serious woman who had played under Vance for a decade, was looking directly at Ilara, clapping with a wide, delighted smile on her face. The cellist, who had followed Ilara's phrasing instead of his beat, was nodding, his eyes closed as if still hearing the music. They were not looking to the podium for their cue to stop. They were lost in the moment she had created. Vance's face felt like a mask of plaster, cracking at the edges. He forced himself to give a small, tight nod towards the orchestra, a ghost of his usual grand gesture. It went unnoticed. He was a man who had spent his life learning how to command silence and demand sound. Now he had no idea how to command this storm of adoration that belonged to someone else. The spotlight, a hot white eye, was fixed on the piano. He stood just outside its edge, in the growing shadows of the stage. Ilara bowed a second time. Then she did something unexpected. She turned not to the audience, but to the orchestra. She made a small, graceful, sweeping gesture with her hand, inviting them to share in the acclaim. It was a genuine musician-to-musician thank you. The applause swelled again, now including the players. Then she looked at Vance. It was only a glance, lasting less than a second. But in that look, there was everything and nothing. There was no smirk, no glint of revenge. It was the same calm, observing look she had given him in the lobby when he had thrown the money into the piano bench. A look that simply saw him, completely and without malice. To him, in his humiliation, that calmness felt worse than any glare of hatred. It meant she had never considered him a true enemy worthy of strong emotion. He had been an obstacle, a sour note, and she had simply played right through him. She turned and walked off the stage, leaving the roaring crowd behind. The stage manager, beaming, held the curtain open for her. The moment she disappeared into the wings, the spell shifted slightly. The applause began to slowly subside, turning into a buzz of excited conversation. People were reaching for their phones, not to check the time, but to text friends, to post online. They had witnessed something. Backstage was chaos, but a joyful one. The managing director, Anya, was there, her earlier anxiety replaced by tears in her eyes. She reached for Alara's hands, words failing her. The old stagehand, Leo, just gave a firm, proud nod from where he stood by the ropes, his work done. But in the center of this small storm, Alara was quiet. She accepted a bottle of water from a stagehand with a murmured thanks. She seemed drained, not by nerves, but by the sheer act of having poured so much of herself into the music. She wasn't celebrating. She was recovering. Meanwhile, Vance stumbled off the podium and into the opposite wing. His dressing room felt like a tomb. The closed door muffled the distant, happy chaos. He sank into a chair, staring at his reflection in the brightly lit mirror. The face looking back was pale, the confident glint in the eyes replaced by a hollow confusion. He could still hear, in his head, the way the orchestra had softened their sound to match her whispers. How they had leaned forward in their seats, not for his dramatic cue, but for the delicate world she was painting. He had been a bystander at his own performance. Out in the hall, the crowd was finally leaving, but slowly, reluctantly. Clusters of people stood talking animatedly in the glittering lobby, right by the same grand piano where this had all begun. Heavens! That was transcendent. One older woman said to her companion, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, "I haven't been moved like that in years. Who is she?" A younger man asked, scrolling on his phone. "There's nothing about her online. It's like she appeared out of thin air." "And that conductor," a third person murmured, lowering their voice. "Did you see his face? He looked like he'd seen a ghost. He hardly did anything up there." The conversation was repeated in different forms all through the crowd. The story was no longer Orchestra Saves the Night with Substitute. It was Mystery Woman Stuns Hall with unforgettable performance. Vance's name, when it was mentioned, was a footnote, and a slightly pitying one. Anya found him in his dressing room 20 minutes later. He was still in his tuxedo, sitting in the same chair. The roar of the crowd was gone, replaced by the quiet hum of the building's air system. "The board. They are over the moon," Anya said carefully, her voice gentle but firm. "They want to offer her a residency. Immediately. Concerts, a recording contract. The press is already calling. The video clips from people's phones are everywhere." Vance didn't turn around. "She played out of tempo," he said, but his voice was weak, the objection automatic and empty. He had heard the perfection in her timing as clearly as anyone. Anya was silent for a moment. She looked at the back of his head, at the proud set of his shoulders that now seemed slumped. "It wasn't about tempo tonight, Maestro," she said softly. "It was about something else." And the audience heard it. "The whole world is going to hear it by morning." She left, closing the door quietly behind her. Vance finally looked up at the mirror. The man staring back was a stranger, a conductor, who had just led the most successful concert of the season, and yet who had never felt more powerless in his life. His career hadn't ended with a single note. But in the silent, empty room, he could hear the first, faint crack in its foundation, a sound as clear and cold as a bell in a distant valley. The morning after the gala, the world outside the Aurora Concert Hall had changed. Inside Vance's spacious, silent apartment, the change felt like a thickening of the air, making it hard to breathe. He sat at his expensive kitchen table, a single newspaper spread open before him. He hadn't slept. The review was not on the front page of the arts section. It was the front page of the arts section. The headline was a single brutal word, asterisk, asterisk, revelation. Asterisk, asterisk, the critic, a man Vance had dined with just a month prior, wrote with breathless excitement. He used words like seismic, authentic, and a voice that speaks to the soul. The name Elara appeared 17 times. The phrase street pianist turned superstar was in the second paragraph. The name Vance appeared twice. Once in the line, conducted by Maestro Vance, and once near the end. While the orchestra under Vance provided a capable, if somewhat tentative, backdrop to her genius. Capable, tentative, backdrop. The words were not insults. They were erasures. They painted him as a stagehand, a man who turned the lights on for the main event. He threw the paper aside. On his tablet, the digital world was worse. A video from the gala, shot shakily from a front-row phone, was already trending. The thumbnail was Elara's face, intent and serene at the piano. The comments section was a river of awe. "I've never heard anything like that. Where has she been hiding? This is what real music sounds like." Scrolling further, he found the older video, the lobby video from their first meeting. It had been resurrected and was now linked to the new one. The caption read, "Conductor throws money at her, then she takes his whole career. Karma is a pianist." He closed the tablet with a sharp click at the hall. The atmosphere was electric, but the current was flowing in a new direction. Anya and the board moved with a swift, decisive energy he'd never seen on routine matters. Within a week, they announced the Aurora residency. New voices. Its inaugural artist, Elara. There were press conferences. She sat quietly, answering questions in her soft, thoughtful voice. She spoke about music being everywhere, about listening, about the sound of rain on subway grates being a kind of rhythm. Reporters hung on her every word. They found her intriguing, authentic. Vance, meanwhile, became a ghost in his own building. Where musicians once stopped to chat, they now gave him polite, hurried smiles. His suggestions in planning meetings were met with respectful nods, then gently set aside. "We're thinking of a more contemporary direction," Anya would say. The programming for the next season landed on his desk. His own featured concerts were still there, but the bold new centerpieces were all Elara's. Solo recitals, collaborations with indie bands, a project with schoolchildren from the inner city. Her face was on the promotional materials. His was in the small list of conductors. The final blow came not with a dramatic firing, but with a quiet conversation. Anya came to his office, her expression polite but unreadable. She spoke of new energies, evolving institutional priorities, and a mutual parting of ways. His contract, she gently explained, would not be renewed at the end of the season. They would, of course, honor it fully. They hoped he would enjoy his final concerts with them. The hall would always value his contributions. The language was so soft, so cushioned in legal and diplomatic kindness, that he couldn't even rage against it. To protest would sound small, bitter. He finished the season. His concerts were competent, well attended by his loyal subscribers, and reviewed with a faint, respectful praise that felt like a pat on the head. The roaring, sold-out crowds, the electric buzz, were now for her residency events. He began packing his office months before his official last day, placing books into boxes with a dull finality. One afternoon, from his soon-to-be former office window, he looked down into the hall's sun-drenched atrium. A small crowd was gathered. Elara was there, not at a piano, but standing with a group of teenagers. They were from a music program for underprivileged youth. She was showing them how the acoustics of the space worked, clapping her hands to demonstrate the echo. She laughed at something a shy girl said, a sound carrying up to him as a faint, happy echo. He watched as she led them to the public piano, the same one from the lobby. She gestured for a lanky boy to sit. He played a few clumsy, halting notes. She didn't correct him. She listened, then played a simple, beautiful harmony around his melody, making his clumsy notes sound intentional, part of something new. The boy's face lit up with stunned joy. Vance turned from the window. The sight was more painful than any bad review. It wasn't about talent or revenge. It was about a simple, devastating truth. She loved the music more than she loved the spotlight, and she believed the music belonged to everyone. He had spent a career believing it belonged only to people like him. A year later, the Aurora Concert Hall had a new name on its artistic director's door. Elira's vision was everywhere community workshops, cheap ticket nights, the stage alive with sounds he once would have called not serious. The hall was more alive, more talked about than it had been in decades. Vance's career did not end. It shrank. He took guest conducting jobs, but no major orchestra offered him a permanent seat. He found himself in smaller cities, with regional orchestras of good, honest musicians who were pleased to have a name from the big leagues, even a tarnished one. He stood on podiums in halls that held 800 people, not 2,000. One cold evening, he found himself in a modest hotel room in one such city. He had a concert the next day. On the local news channel, a cultural segment came on. It was about the transformational work happening at the Aurora Hall. There was a clip of Elira speaking about breaking down walls. Then, a quick shot of the beautiful renovated community music space in the hall's basement, named after the old stagehand Leo, who had passed away peacefully the month before. It was full of people, of noise, of life. Vance switched off the TV. The silence of the hotel room was complete. He thought of the roaring applause that once was his, the power of his raised baton, the certainty of his taste. It all felt like a costume he had worn a long time ago, now hanging empty in a closet. His downfall was not that he was hated, or even that he was wrong. It was that he had become irrelevant. The world of music had gently, and with breathtaking beauty, simply moved past him. His career had not been taken by a rival, but made quiet by a new song, a song that began not with a bang, but with the clear, lonely, perfect ring of a single bell, played by a woman who remembered what he had long forgotten. That music, at its heart, is a gift meant to be shared.